as well. So Mr. Isaczai, as the Special Representative of the Secretary General here in Iraq and leading the UNAMI program, I wonder if you could reflect on what UNAMI has taught us about how we can deliver these kinds of programs here and elsewhere. What are the greatest successes and potential failures of the UNAMI initiative?
Thank you, and also I want to thank the university for this opportunity. If you allow me, I want to just add a point of clarification. When we talk about UNAMI, it's a political entity set up by the Security Council mandate, but a lot of the humanitarian and development work is delivered by 24 other United Nations agencies. So I will not be really speaking much about UNAMI's political work, which is a very different kettle of fish, I would say. But of course, as Thomas mentioned, we work in a very triple nix function, where you have the political, the humanitarian, and the development working, or should be working together, really to find solutions to Iraq. I would like to actually start my discussion on the broader humanitarian situation and then come to Iraq. Just because if you look at the statistic, it's really staggering that in the last 10 years, that the humanitarian situation have gotten actually worse. If we, and there's more and more pressure on the international organization, on the UN in particular, to really deliver humanitarian services. And of course, I wouldn't discount our local partners and donors. Just to give you some figures, in 2014, there were 76 million people dependent on humanitarian aid in 24 countries. Today, 10 years later, we have 184 million people in 73 countries dependent on humanitarian aid. That's a huge increase and puts a lot of stress on the humanitarian community to deliver services and to save lives and to basically protect civilians. And this is in comparison to, in terms of, also if you look at it in dollar figure, this year the global humanitarian overview was $46 billion compared to $19 billion again almost 10 years ago. And compare that with $2.2 trillion that was spent on defense budget. $2.2 trillion was spent on defense in comparison to $46 billion that is now requested to feed and support 184 million. I just wanted to give you this food for thought and put all of this in the context. Now coming to Iraq. In Iraq, of course, 2003 was a watershed moment, not only for Iraqis, but also for the UN. As you know, the Canal Hotel bombing, where the United Nations lost 22 of its staff, was a watershed in a sense that it actually turned the debate on humanitarianism from one being respected to one being targeted. So since then, the humanitarian community has been really targeted either by states or non-state actors. Last year alone, we had over 400 violence reported against humanitarian workers. And out of that, 134 were actually killed. Now, I'm not sure if that figure includes what's happening in Gaza today. So we see enormous disrespect for international humanitarian law, international humanitarian principles, and state and non-state actors are violating it. And therefore, for us really to move from this situation, we have to really advocate and go back to countries respecting international humanitarian law and international humanitarian principles. So that's where I wanted to give you a little bit of the context. Now, in Iraq, as I said, that 2003 was a watershed moment because that's when also the General Assembly moved a few years later to establish the International Humanitarian Day, or the World Humanitarian Day. And ever since, of course, the United Nations has been very active in Iraq's reconstruction and also rebuilding. Our work actually accelerated in 2014 after the crisis of Daesh. And I would actually see a little bit the glass half full. I know you've put some of the challenges that's confronting, and I'll come back to that because there are some actually relevant points you're making. But if we look at overall, in terms of the positive that Iraq has really witnessed, is that in 2017, we had around 11 million displaced Iraqis. Now that figure has come down to less than 1 million. And during that period, of course, around $5.5 billion was channeled through the what we call it humanitarian response plan, and thanks to our donors and also partners. And in these, I would say 8 years or plus, we've seen a lot of work that was supported by the United Nations humanitarian agencies and also our partners, whether they were locals or internationals. We've built more than 4,000 or 5,000 infrastructure projects in the 5 conflict-affected governorates, most of it, of course, in Nineveh, Anbar, and also Salahuddin, Diyala, and Kirkuk. Just to give you one example, the Mosul University became a wasteland when it was at one point hosting 30,000 students. Our support enabled it now for Mosul now to be again a very thriving and successful university. In Sinjar, we have reconstructed and rehabilitated over 5,000 shelters, 52 schools, hospitals, and so forth. Now, just to come back to Ambassador Thomas and also our other panelists, is humanitarian aid and development aid is not the solution. I think where we have to emphasize, in my view, is national ownership, whether that national ownership rests with the government or with the local NGOs and civil society organizations. And that's what we are trying to move towards. Our next 5-year cooperation framework that we are working on for the next 5 years, starting 2025, is really a paradigm shift. We're going to move from this aid dependency to more technical assistance. Because if you look at it really, the UN, yes, we have humanitarian agencies, but our role and comparative advantage is really technical assistance. We bring the normative agenda. We would like to bring advisory support, technical assistance, knowledge, best practices, and to make sure that countries like Iraq also meet its international obligations and commitments, whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals, Paris Agreement on climate change, and many more. And for us to help Iraq to also improve its ranking, whether it's in doing business or transparency, international index on corruption, and many more. So I think my frustration always is when I engage with the government, they still see the UN as a donor. And we are actually not a donor. We have donors like EU, we have Italy, and many more. But I think our role comes more in providing technical assistance, enabling state building, capacity building, enabling countries to withstand on its own feet in the long run. Let me leave it there.
Thank you very much. And in the short time we have left, we have a number of questions from the audience, which I'm keen to try and consolidate. So back to Lahib, we have a question from the audience asking about the effects of what's happening in Gaza on Iraq and whether or not there may be any response that's required from that perspective.
The effect on Iraq?
Any effects on Iraq from the current issues